We're good? Okay. Well, I don't know whether I'm going to finish the 24 Theses tonight or not. I have a couple items here that may delay us a tiny bit. I came across a survey on the internet today, which I found very interesting because it is the Pew Research Group asking people whether they see belief in God as essential to morality. In other words, in order to have morality, do you have to believe in God? Now be careful, because that can be a complex question. It doesn't necessarily mean if they say that you can believe in morality without believing in God, that doesn't necessarily mean they don't believe in God. Nevertheless, the results were interesting for this reason. Most of the world maintains that you have to believe in God in order to have morality. But the developed world doesn't. Most of Western Europe, in other words, you're not going to get total splits, but these are where the dominance, like you may get 66% of the people in Germany would say it's not necessary to believe in God in order to be moral, and only 33% would say you wouldn't need to. So in Europe, generally, they would say you don't have to believe in God to be moral. France is the worst. 85% would say that you don't have to believe in God to be moral. Now, this doesn't mean they don't believe in God, but it does give you a sense of the secular flavor of the country. The curious thing is that among the developed countries, there is only one major country, or one country, I guess almost of all those that they surveyed, that said, the majority said that it's necessary to believe in God to be moral. Believe it or not, it's the United States of America. Not Canada. Canada, 67% no, 31% yes. US, it's 53% yes, 46% no. Now, most of the rest of the world, Middle East, Asia, Latin America, Africa, by and large, some of them by huge amounts would say you have to believe in God to have morality. Like Ghana, it's 99% that it's necessary against 1% that it isn't. Not too surprisingly, in the Middle East, which of course would largely be Muslim, they say yes, you have to believe in God. Most of Asia tends in the direction of saying, yes, you have to believe in God. But again, the ones that are overwhelmingly yes are Indonesia and Pakistan, which are Muslim countries. So that's predictable. The one real glaring exception is China, understandably. And, I forgot one other developed country, Australia. Australia, 76% would say not necessary to believe in God to be moral.
I don't think it is either. I
Well,
don't think they have to believe in God to be moral.
Well,
I think there's a relationship that happens.
I'll be gentle. You're wrong, but you're wrong, but
I don't believe that wrong.
well, I know you don't believe you're wrong. I agree with you.
Why?
You must not have been here when we went through that part in ethics.
Because human to human on Earth realizes that if you do something to hurt another person, you may get the same thing back. And therefore, they begin to create laws that would be moral in a sense. Maybe moral is the wrong word.
Well, the concept of morality, though, as being something that is universal, binding, and necessary, no exceptions, that implies that you don't make it up yourself. Because if you find it in your best interest to act that way, you're not acting morally, you're acting in terms of your self-interest.
No, because the government can impose behaviors they already do, and they don't always believe in God.
I agree that you can have a code of morality. The problem is, where does it come from? Ultimately, you are responsible to no one but yourself unless there's somebody above you. If God does not exist, I am responsible to no one. The government then becomes God, or I become God because I am saying what my morals will be. I'm establishing them, but that means I could also change them if I decided something different. The concept of objective morality is I can't do anything about it. It is given, and it is given because I didn't invent it, I didn't sanction it, but it comes from God, and God creates man, and man has to follow the laws of God.
But you don't have to admit that, and still
I
morality
realize.
could exist.
Well, it depends on how you're defining morality. You're defining morality differently. I agree that the survey could be misleading in terms of secularism because there are a lot of people that think the way you do, who
Well,
would say
I really thought
would-
that. I'm giving you the devil's
Yeah.
advocate portion of that I think would be true.
Right, but I was going to say that is true, that a lot of people would say that there's morality because and yet they still believe in God, but they say you could have morality without God because they've got that notion that somehow you can have a set of morals. But the point they're missing is that the morals then are your morals, which means you can change them. The atheist will always say, I'm as moral as you are, but ask him why is he holding the morals he's got? Ultimately, it's because they're his morals. Even if you accept natural law, you're accepting it because you embrace it as natural law. In other words, you might say, well, if you don't follow nature, your life will be self-destructive. Well, why shouldn't it be? Or why shouldn't you commit suicide? Ultimately, for so many people, that's perfectly moral. The point is, if you're ultimately the author of your morality, then you don't really have morals. What you've got is a set of rules that you have made up for yourself, even if you got them from some kind of evaluation of a quid pro quo that it works best for you. That does not mean you have objective morals. What it means is you've got a subjective set of morals that you have sanctioned, and because you've sanctioned them, you can change them. That's the problem with the atheist. Ultimately, if he decides he's going to have a different set, he can have a different set. The only time you have an objective set is when you can't change them. And you can't change them if you didn't make them up or if you didn't accede to them. And that's the only way you're going to have that is if you're responsible to something beyond yourself. But so this, I concur that this survey doesn't necessarily mean that the Western democracies, the well-to-do countries, the first world countries, are necessarily atheistic. Not logically, but in fact, that's how it comes about. I can understand that most people in the more advanced countries might say, well, yeah, you can have morals without God. And they still, many of them would believe in God. The majority do, I'm sure. But it does go hand in hand with the development of a secular educational system. That's what you're seeing. They also have a correlation where they did it according to economic development, and you can guess how that one turns out. Again, the countries with the greatest per capita income are the ones who would say you can have morals without God, and the ones that have the least income are the ones that say, no, you're going to have God. Again, you see a division between ages. The older people would say you got to have God to have morality. The younger people say no. But by and large, I think this does indicate the degree of secular influence in advanced countries, and it does reflect, and it does help us to understand why more and more you see among the younger, better educated people, more atheists, plain and simple, because we live in a culture in which people are being taught that, the world works and you don't need God. So it's a pity because it isn't that the evidence has changed, it's just that people have become conditioned in the educational system and in the culture to think that it's perfectly reasonable not to believe in God, and they really aren't that much different than Laplace, who said we don't need that hypothesis anymore. We used to believe in God, now we see that the laws of nature explain everything. So in a very real practical sense, secular scientific materialism is on the roll towards winning the day in the minds and hearts of people, because this is what they see. And of course, the problem is you have a partial education. You have all the mistakes that people make about proving God's existence, all the erroneous claims that they make, like the universal one, you can believe in God, but everybody knows you can't prove him. Everybody knows that. Well, everybody doesn't know that.
Isn't the law of God already embedded in us? Isn't that the reality that we teach? Therefore, when we act as a society, you keep saying you make up your own laws, but I'm thinking of society making laws. Because it's coming out of something that's already in the heart of man. That's true. You have to admit there's a God, and it's still...
Well, I know, but the reason you know that it's coming out of the heart of man as created by God is because you already know God exists. And that indeed is the mechanism that gives forth a certain kind of natural morality in society. But the society doesn't have to recognize where it came from. And as a matter of fact, as the Christian influence in society has diminished more and more and more, we find sanctioned in society types of behavior that are more violently contrary to natural law. So we are running on leftover gas, as you already know.
My one friend says we're running on the fumes from the empty bottle.
Yeah, that's right. That is unfortunately the case, but that's why all the more reason there is need to understand sound philosophy. It's just I can't tell you that this is a winning proposition. I can't tell you that more and more people are going to know these things. The fact that they are true doesn't mean that they're in a state of ascendancy in terms of the popular culture. And unfortunately, I don't know when or if that's going to turn around. But it doesn't make it any less true, and it doesn't make it any less useful personally to know what the truth is and to be able to teach it to others. One of the biggest problems that you have in education today, in fact, I was just looking at some course surveys for somebody I know who's in the teaching field, and one of the criticisms that the students would write, and they do this all the time, they did it with me, they did it with Dr. Waters, he's insisting that there's a truth. He's insisting that his way is right. How dare he do that? Of course, if you were taking a course in chemistry, the guy teaching chemistry, he's going to insist that his way is right, isn't he? You don't, in any science, you don't expect them to be saying, well, this is how I feel about the way sodium and chlorine combine, but you may feel something different, and it's not my right to impose my views on you. No, everybody knows that. But yet in philosophy, oh heavens, everybody's got to have his own opinion, and it's all just as good as what the professor knows. Well, you could say goodbye to science. The whole meaning of science is that there is an orderly body of knowledge, and that in order to say you understand the science, you have to understand that set of knowledge, and you have to know what is true and what is false, and you have to be able to say something's wrong. And just because somebody ardently holds it doesn't make it right. So anyway, let's go back to the 24 Theses. But this survey, I think, is relevant to it because it tells you the degree to which the world as a whole is losing its grip on reality in a very real sense. Thomism is said to have an assimilative capacity. What that means is it can validly accommodate new data. And that's the reason for this is because it reaches to the intelligibility of being itself. And because it does, the rules of being apply to anything. So you're not going to run into something new that it doesn't fit. It's not like some essential set of rules that apply to a certain part of reality and then you bring in some new data and it doesn't work anymore. Because these are laws of being, they are transcendentally valid. And that's why you're not going to come up with some new problem in bioethics that the principles of natural law cannot untangle. It trumps all physics or natural philosophy, psychology, ethics, or any other doctrine that is not based on universal being. As you think about these other sciences, physics is limited to a certain part of the world. There's the material world, force, motion, and so forth. Psychology is restricted to the laws that pertain to the human psyche and mind and so forth. Ethics is restricted to the domain of personal behavior. So that various sciences are limited as to their subject matter and the way, the formal aspect that they address that subject matter with. They're limited, but the basic principles of being, which we study in metaphysics, pertain to any being considered as a being, and hence they must follow it. So these first principles that we learn when we first encounter being through our senses, non-contradiction, sufficient reason, identity, you can just apply them to anything without the least fear that they're not going to apply suddenly. That's why they're the laws that hold good for all possible being, not just for all possible chickens. So you might run into a mongoose that isn't a chicken and doesn't obey the same laws, but they're still both beings, and they still must obey the law of being. Also, Thomism solves all the great problems we encounter by applying the division of potency and act. Because remember, when you're talking about potency and act, you're talking about being. You're talking about the distinction about something that is not yet what it will be, but it can be. That's the notion of potency. In terms of being, you're talking about what can be. It can be, but it isn't yet being. So potency is defined in terms of being. Act, of course, is actually being. So it's not like we're grabbing a couple principles off on the side, potency and act, like they're separate from the first laws of being. They are simply a division between what actually is being and what is not yet or could be being. But they still are a fundamental division within the general concept of being. So it's not something new, it's not something on the side, and that's why potency and act applies to everything. See, that's the rigorous force of Thomistic philosophy, that it's rooted in this existential metaphysics that applies to absolutely anything that can possibly be. And for this reason, this makes Thomistic philosophy, particularly in its metaphysics, realistic, because it applies to real being, not only within the mind, but outside the mind, anywhere being is to be found. It's not just some kind of a subjective idealism that holds good only for possible experience. It holds good for everything. It is intellectualistic because it's an intellectual understanding of the nature of being and of the nature of things that are found in being. Because after all, what's a nature? If you think about it, we oppose nature to being as essence to existence. But nature is simply a way of describing the aspects of being that a certain being has, as opposed to the aspects it doesn't have. So, what's a bird? It's a two-footed flying kind of being that lays eggs and builds nests, usually. In other words, I'm describing a certain kind of being. It's different than an elephant. It's got a big trunk and floppy ears and so forth, and doesn't fly very well except in Dumbo. See, all I'm doing is describing different qualities of being. So the intellect grasps the being of the things we encounter, including the aspects of being a thing has and the aspects it doesn't have. So the intellect this is an intellectualistic power that the mind has to know being as we encounter it. Goes beyond what the senses do, because the senses aren't able to catalog these qualities and to recognize the intelligibility of a nature as such, which the mind can do. So it's the wondrous thing that the senses, animals have senses, but the senses are stopped at the level of the phenomena. The senses stop at the external aspects of things. The intellect penetrates beyond these and grasps the very being of the thing that's encountered, even to the very nature in which that being is expressed. What an amazing thing it is that we have an intellect. What a pitiful thing it is that half the people don't know it. And 80% can't use what they've got. I was told by my Latin professor, Father Hugh P. O'Neill, a Jesuit at the University of Detroit, wonderful, wonderful thinker. Taught you Latin, taught you how to think. Pointed out, I think he said 90% of the people cannot think in essential terms. That's
Central?
in essential terms.
What do you mean by
Other-
essential, just so
Is it-
we, according to essences, is that what you're saying?
As opposed to accidentals.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, most people tend to think in terms of accidentals. And that's why you get things like racism. What's racism based on? I'm stuck on your color. You don't grasp that you're dealing with a human being. And that indeed, it just makes me think back to when I was teaching in New Orleans, longer ago than I'll admit. It was back in the 60s, the previous century. I remember one of the girls that I had as an assistant who was black, and she was telling me the difference between the people in New Orleans in their attitude towards the blacks as opposed to the people up in the Plaquemines parishes up north of Lake Pontchartrain. In other words, I'm not Plaquemine, the Florida parishes up north of Lake Pontchartrain and across to Florida, the Florida Panhandle, which are predominantly Protestant. The ones in New Orleans were Catholic. And he said the difference is the ones in New Orleans discriminated against you, but they thought you had a soul. But the Protestants didn't. Now, I'm just telling you what she told me. This is 1960.
What,
They didn't think you had a soul. And of course, remember, that was a difference between the attitude of the Catholics and the Protestants in colonizing the New World, because the Protestants enslaved the blacks, and they viewed the natives as not really being part of the human race. Some of the Catholic philosophers early on came to the conclusion that the natives in Latin America were human beings and had souls, and that's why, of course, you had the Spaniards intermarrying with the natives, and a completely different culture formed.
And also missionizing.
Yes, yeah,
That was
exactly.
an essential element of everything.
Well, yeah, why, you don't have a mission to the elephants or the kangaroos. So, but again, it's because many people don't get beyond the accidentals. And that racism is an example of this, I guess. But you'll find a lot of people that do not think in terms of the essence of an argument. You can't get them to come back to the essential qualities. So they'll give you all kinds of emotional arguments. They'll give you arguments from authority or precedence or anything you want, but you can't get them to think in terms of the nature of what you're dealing with and follow one concept to another to another. It's very hard for people to learn how to do that. But what Father O'Neill was telling us is, just by nature, probably only 10% of the people are able to do this.
if they were slave owners, they married, a lot of times they married or had relations.
Yeah, they had relations. That's not the same thing as marrying.
No, but if they,
That's why you had a history of segregation in the South.
But if they don't recognize them as people, they see that they bear children and all that.
It obviously didn't impress them.
So you're saying that the real distinction in the days of slavery were between Catholics and Protestants?
I'm just telling you what this gal down in New Orleans told me. I think that obviously it depends on who you're talking to. You had Protestant missionaries who would work, I'm sure, in the South to try to convert the blacks. Otherwise, you wouldn't have all the black Baptists. So I mean, obviously, this is something that we have grown out of. But in its initial stages, you did see a difference. And it's not inherent to Protestantism versus Catholicism, but it's a historical fact that these differences occurred. And unless this girl just didn't know what she was talking about at all, it's a pretty decisive difference to say they believe you got a soul as saying they didn't believe you had a soul. And she was the object of the experience. So I don't, and you know, none of this stuff is universal, because you're always going to find exceptions and differences and a historical blending from one position to another. But it is interesting as kind of a momentary photograph in time to see what kind of differences people could have in their attitudes and what it would be based upon. I certainly do not suggest that Protestantism per se would have to run around saying that black people don't have souls, because even if that were ever true in a given place at a given time, it obviously isn't true today. But it does. But there were differences, and there were differences in attitude. And as I say, it was the late 17th or 16th century that a couple of Catholic theologians actually worked out the arguments to say, yeah, these people are human beings just like us. It was something that had to get written down and notice and clarify as a matter of universal policy. So again, it's something you kind of got to think out.
I suppose it's a question what you call a slave, because our Constitution says all men are created equal. Or Declaration, excuse me.
Yeah,
I'm not good at history.
you're in good company. Some judge just came down with a decision and made that exact same mistake.
Sorry.
She did, and I don't blame you, but she was a judge. She says, as the Constitution says. Idiot.
Well, it's even better then that it's a Declaration of Independence.
The judge.
It's even better then that it comes out of the Declaration of Independence.
Well, again, you get a fight between those constitutionalists say you follow only the Constitution and those who incorporate the Declaration. But that's.
If we go that far, there is some nations from the thousands of years in their teaching to their children, to their ancestors, that they are the chosen one, and the rest is just animals or whatever, and should serve them only. If we go that far, it also wasn't just Catholics, blacks or Protestants.
Yeah.
It's since the Old Testament, we have a group of people who say that you, me, blacks, and others, we're all the same, and we are not.
Again, the point though is that these kinds of distinctions are possible, and people do fall into them. Also, because of the distinction between potency and act, Thomism leads inevitably to the primary actuality, which is God, pure act. And when you stop and think about it, what this really means is that God being pure act, we're discovering, because we're starting at the end of reality we're in, and we're led back to God as pure act. But when you get to God as pure act, you got to realize that in the real order of things, that's where reality begins. And that's why you find a distinction made within Aristotle and within St. Thomas and others between what is first in the order of knowing and what is first in the order of being. What is first in the order of knowing for us is sensible reality. And then we work our way back to what is first in the order of being, which is God himself. And what we sometimes forget, we take these first principles of being as being absolutely first and primary, but you know what? They are because God is. God is the absolute being, which is the foundation for these first principles. We find these principles only in participated being, the things around us that are creatures, little shaves, of the reality that comes from God. And so our first experience with the first principles are in limited beings. The primary analogate for all the principles is God himself. So Thomism leads us back to this ultimate foundation for all existence, all creation, and all knowledge of everything, which is God himself. And does so using these principles of being, which are grounded initially in sensation. This is why it isn't just one philosophy among others, but it is the only philosophy. Remember, Dr. Waters so frequently reminds us of the distinction between those two basic kinds of philosophy. But we won't mention them tonight. You already all know them. So, Thomism is grounded in a natural order which is based on being, which is transcendentally valid, and which in terms of potency act leads us to the highest of all beings, God himself. These highest principles that you find in Thomistic metaphysics serve to illuminate theology with certitude that you would not otherwise have. Less universal principles that you find in other philosophies are based on things like the will, or human action, or progress, or subjective experience, or existential encounter, or man's history. You can see those kinds of limited insights could never give you this transcendental certitude that you find within Thomistic metaphysics. And when you apply some of those other concepts, especially the one of progress and evolution, to theology, you destroy theology. You destroy the permanence of the truths that are contained within theology. What is theology? You're taking revelation and you're applying human reason to it. That's why theology is the queen of the sciences and philosophy is her handmaiden. Now, you need to have a loyal and trustworthy handmaiden. If the handmaiden is not a valid instrument, then the revelation is going to be misunderstood and perverted. So you can't just have any philosophy you want attached to revelation. You can't have any philosophy you want attached to theology. And this is why you may add insights from some other perspective. For example, some of the insights from phenomenology that are introduced by somebody like Dietrich von Hildebrand are wonderful insights to help us understand things like marriage and the relationship between the sexes and so forth, and ethics. But they do not gainsay, they don't contradict what is known in basic Thomistic metaphysics and natural law. They cannot do that. They can illuminate it further, but they don't replace it. They don't become an ethics unto themselves. That's the problem. When you have one of these other philosophies that have a partial master idea, if it becomes the science through which everything is understood, you have then replaced this universal science of being, which cannot be replaced. So it isn't that Thomism is irreplaceable because St. Thomas wrote it, but it's because the doctrine, method, and principles which he espoused are irreplaceable, just by their nature. Not a question of anybody saying it. It just flows from the nature of being. So we begin in sensation, and what is experienced in sensation is illuminated by the intellect using these basic first principles to enable us to ascend to the great truths pertaining to the soul and to ethics and to God himself. And this is why you don't have to wait for them to come up with a new philosophy, a better one. And that's part of the era of philosophy of progress, that progress always makes things better. As we know in the real world, progress doesn't always make things better. Good Lord, look at the 20th century. We killed more people in the 20th century than the rest of history of mankind. We developed the technology of mass annihilation. Yes, we're making progress in the order of technology, but it's almost inversely proportional to our development as human beings, as ethical beings, as virtuous beings. The technological progress would be wonderful if we could get it to align with human virtue. Aristotle, remember, comes 1,600 years or so before St. Thomas. Aristotle by himself has, he's unequaled when you consider what he had to work with. Unequaled. That's why Father Garrigou-Lagrange said he could teach on Aristotle for 300 years. But the fact remains, he was still a pagan. He still did not have the revelation that came with Judaism and Christianity, which gave us an illumination of the way things ultimately are. So, yes, he argues in his Metaphysics, or in his Physics, books 6 through 8, that there must be a prime mover unmoved. But many people don't realize he's talking about a last cause. He's talking about a final cause. He's not talking about a first efficient cause. He's not talking about a maker of the world. He's not talking about an efficient cause that's producing motion in all things. He's seeing this God as a final cause attracting things that already exist. The world's already here. It's not the prime mover unmoved isn't creating the world. It's sitting there in a splendid isolation, a thought thinking itself, attracting all things unto itself. And it remains in doubt as to whether he's talking about one God. Because there is a text in the Metaphysics where he's arguing with himself as to whether there's 47 or 55 of these first movers. Because you've got all these different, concentric, geocentric spheres going around the earth, and every one is a different order of motion. So for each different order of motion, you got to have a first mover in that order. It's a little, that sounds a tiny bit polytheistic. And he wasn't doing it just because he didn't want to get in trouble with the powers that be, because in the immediately preceding paragraph, he's telling us how the anthropological gods, Zeus and so forth, that these are, not to be taken seriously. So it wasn't that he was fearing that he'd suffer censorship of some type. So it isn't clear in Aristotle, and it isn't even clear his concept of the soul. St. Thomas says it is, but St. Thomas is commenting on Aristotle as St. Thomas understands it. But Averroes and Avicenna, the great Muslim commentators, reading the same text, don't get the same soul that Aristotle sees. They got like one world soul.
Aquinas.
I'm sorry, you're right, that Aquinas sees. Aquinas is seeing it correctly in Aristotle because Aquinas sees it correctly. And he knows that that must be what Aristotle either said or it's what he should have said. So Aristotle is not St. Thomas. He is incredible, but give him his due, but you got 15, 16 centuries between them. And you've got the illumination of Christian revelation, which raises the issue of what's sometimes called Christian philosophy. When I first got out of Notre Dame, back in the early 1960s, there was a big fight about, is there a Christian philosophy? And many of the philosophers saying, no, you can't have a Christian philosophy. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, if you're somehow introducing revelation to philosophy, it's faith. And by definition, if it's a science, a natural science, it's got to be pure reason, and therefore, by definition, it cannot be different than a purely natural science. So there is no Christian philosophy. Etienne Gilson and Father Lagrange and others say, no, there's a Christian philosophy, but let's not make it something that it isn't. It's simply that the person who is doing philosophy, if he has, by Christian belief, an understanding of certain truths, however he gets them doesn't matter, but if he understands certain truths, he will know where to look for reason to support what has been divinely revealed. And if he's a good philosopher, he'll know what can be demonstrated and he'll know what can't be demonstrated. He'll know what is based on reason and what isn't. It's like if you have a road map. I took a trip when I was young with my mother. We got one of those AAA triptychs that took us all the way. We were heading off to New England, and we got to some place where there was a river, and the triptych said, there's a bridge here, just drive across and keep going. There was no bridge. We did not drive into the river. We saw there was no bridge. We stopped. We found another way to go. A good philosopher knows when reason will get him across the bridge and when it won't. So he may say, okay, I've reached something where faith has said something that transcends what reason can achieve. And that is a matter of faith. But if reason can achieve it, then it can be a proper object of philosophical science. And that's precisely why those who say that everybody knows you believe in God, but you can't prove it, well, they clearly are not recognizing the validity of a Christian philosophy that doesn't believe in God because of Christian revelation per se, but can understand the reasons why reason necessitates that there be such a being as what we call God. But it doesn't demonstrate to us the existence of a Trinity. It doesn't demonstrate to us the incarnation. Those things are not demonstrable because in the one case, in the case of the Trinity, they utterly transcend what reason can attain. In the case of the incarnation, even if you conceive it as possible, it's not necessary. It didn't have to be. Therefore, reason can't demonstrate that it must be. That doesn't mean you can't know it by other rational means, such as the study of history and so forth. So, is there a Christian philosophy? I would say, just don't get too excited about the topic. Just be thankful if Christianity gives us some hints, gives us a good Boy Scout manual that gets us someplace, tells us how to start the fire and it lights. Well, thank God. And that, of course, is, I think, what Leo XIII had in mind when he issued the encyclical in which he asked for a rebirth of the study of Thomism. I don't know exactly why this comes in here, but I wanted to talk for a few minutes about the levels of abstraction, because ultimately they show us why we get to these first principles and a transcendental metaphysics. The levels of abstraction, which I think you'll find in Boetium de Trinitate, You don't need to know where exactly, but St. Thomas talks about the various levels of abstraction, as does Aristotle. The first level is physics, where we're studying the nature of the physical world around us. It's called the philosophy of nature. And of course, when you say physics today, they think, well, you mean the contemporary physics. No, this isn't the contemporary physics. This is the physics that is presupposed by the contemporary physicist, and which the contemporary physicist doesn't even know. That's the more relevant point.
I was reading something this week and I got a little confused. Is there a difference between natural, philosophy of nature and cosmology? So one.
Not that I know of.
Okay, one manual was saying that it was, but I didn't. Even when they explained it, it didn't quite add up to me.
The cosmology, ontology, psychology, those are terms that were invented by the Leibnizo-Wolffian schools in the 17th and 18th century. They were the names they give to what was originally the physics and the metaphysics. So the more traditional names would be physics or philosophy of nature, and then psychology or rational psychology or philosophy of human nature. These are some of the different names that have been used in the different Catholic schools. And then finally, metaphysics. But the Jesuit schools in the 17th, 18th century, they referred to them as psychology, cosmology, and ontology. Now, cosmology today is a subdivision of the modern science of physics, so that relates to the origins of the universe. So the science of the cosmos. See, so we get all confused. And if you talk to somebody who is in one field, they're going to use the term from a different field. You're not going to know what they're talking about. So it's always good to ask people to define what they mean by a term. But within philosophy, within Aristotelian and Thomistic philosophy, cosmology is used interchangeably with the philosophy of nature or physics. Now, the physics, or cosmology, deals with the general nature of matter. It considers material things in terms of their materiality and in terms of the general laws that pertain to material things. And that's why Aristotle starts out by dividing all natural substances into substance and 9 categories of accident. See, that pertains to the philosophy of nature. Now, the contemporary physicists don't do that, do they? They just start talking about the qualities of things. And they don't claim to know the very substance of anything. That's one of the things, contemporary physics, what are you dealing with? Dealing with phenomena. You're dealing with what they believe to be extramental realities, but they are as perceived by the senses. It's kind of a Kantian hangover. And of course, what else do we do in the physics? We study the nature of motion. What is motion? Now, by the time you get to Descartes, when Descartes says, what is motion? He says, this is motion, waving his hand. That's talking about an accidental brain. That isn't defining motion. That's just pointing to an example of it. It's like saying, what is a chicken? Well, there's a chicken. Okay, that's brilliant. So, no, that's what Aristotle gives an essential definition. The act of a being in potency, insofar as it is in potency. You know, when I first threw that definition out to you some time ago, you're scratching your head, what's it all about? Now you notice, don't you? It's in terms of potency and act that it's given. And that's why it tells us what motion really is. And then we discover, hey, things that are in motion, they can't move themselves. Because if they're in potency, they can't give act to themselves. They can't give themselves the being they don't yet have. So something that's in motion has to be caused to be in motion by something else. And then, of course, we show that you can't have an infinite regress that leads you back to a first mover unmoved. In Aristotle, but remember that first mover unmoved is a final cause, not an efficient cause. What else do you do in the physics? Well, you study what is space, what is place, what is time, what is relation. He's going through a lot of the categories that you do in the first book. I always love the definition of place. You know what it means to be in a place, or what is a place? Place is the inner surrounding surface of the outer surrounding medium. That's the kind of stuff you do in physics. And you can discover wonderful things like the universe isn't anywhere because it isn't any place. There's no medium around the universe in which to describe its inner surface. So while things can be in a place relative to other parts of the universe itself is nowhere. Go to your local physicist and ask him to comment on these things. Pick up a textbook in physics or chemistry or astronomy and find a definition of motion. See if you can do that. Good luck. These things are defined. The terms, every term, you'd say, well, every term in science is defined. Most of these textbooks have a glossary. Go look at the glossary. See how everything's defined. Everything's defined in terms of other terms that are in the glossary, except when you get down to the basic terms, then they're not defined because they can't define them. Now, what's a horsepower? It's the ability to raise 550 pounds 1 foot in 1 second. Okay, what's the definition for raise? Well, you go from a lower place to a higher place. What's the definition of go? See, you're going to wind up back where Aristotle was, and these guys aren't ready to hack it. It's the most obvious things are the most difficult to explain and defend and to understand. So when you look at cosmology, when you look at the philosophy of nature, that's the basic science that everybody was studying to begin with. And it's only as we go through later centuries that you begin to see scientists after the Renaissance particularly starting to study what we today would call biology or botany or physics or astronomy. But, you know, what was their job? What was their title? They were all philosophers. What were they? They're philosophers of nature. I remember seeing a book by a physicist published in 1900, and the professor who wrote the book was listed as a professor of natural philosophy. 1900, and it was pure physics. So that's the transition that you made to the particular sciences which are experimental sciences, and whose subject matter is defined in different ways, and where they are also distinguished by their formal object. Remember, what's the subject matter of physics? It's the whole physical universe, isn't it? What's the subject matter of astronomy? It's the whole physical universe. What's the subject matter of chemistry? It's the whole physical universe. Difference isn't in the subject matter. Difference is the way you look at it. The physicist is looking at it from the standpoint of matter and motion and force. The chemist is looking at it from the standpoint of little tiny, tiny particles and how they interact. And the astronomer's looking at really big stuff. That's the scientific distinction. But none of that's to be confused with the philosophical science of physics. which is presupposed by all these particular sciences. And that's you get the absurdity that somebody can today get a doctorate in physics and never had a course in philosophy. And what degree do they give him?
A doctor of philosophy.
Doctor of Philosophy, Doctor Philosophiae. And so ask him, what's your philosophy? I don't know what to say. They'll say, so that's the we'll call the first level of abstraction. You're looking at physical things in terms of their whole physical reality. The second level of abstraction is mathematics. That's where you look at not the general nature of matter, but you abstract from all the sensible qualities, excepting quantity. The only thing you look at, the only aspect you look at is quantity. If you're looking at discrete quantity, that's numbers. If you're looking at continuous quantity, you're looking at figures and dimensions. That's the second level abstraction. The third level is where you prescind from the physical characteristics of the things you encounter completely. You don't look at being as extended in space. And by the way, the subject matter of physics is not insensibile, but ens mobile, movable being. Movable being is the subject matter of physics. What's the formal aspect you look at? You're looking at movable being qua movable, as movable. In mathematics, you're looking at movable being, but as quantifiable. And in metaphysics, you start with movable being, because that's all you know to begin with, but you look at it not as movable, not as quantifiable, but as being. Strictly as being. Being considered as being. That's metaphysics. So you abstract from each subject to get to the laws of being which apply to all things, even if they're not merely movable. And that, of course, is what Aristotle discovers in the 8th book of his Physics, that there are some beings. Remember, he started with being as movable. He discovers a first mover, guess what? Unmoved, unmovable. So he's discovered that the being that he's studying inevitably forces him to the conclusion of the existence of a being which transcends the subject matter of the science, and which forces him into metaphysics. So physics leads you to metaphysics. That's what Dr. de Koninck was always trying to tell us. You got to go all the way through physics before you can get to metaphysics. Of course, you can cheat by just using one of the proofs for God's existence and go right there fast. Okay. Unfortunately, I don't think we have time to do much more tonight, and there are a few more things we may do, so we're just going to have to put it off to one more class.
Sound production copyright Oltine Library Services, all rights reserved. www.aquinasphilosophy.com